This presentation is called Circe's Vase, Kristen Stewart and Alexander Dugin, a clash of cosmic proportions. It will take the form of a short sort of caravanserai journey through metaphysics as, um, let's say, under the aspect of Croce saying that all history is present history. Um, so far as present means making a presentation, which I'm aware that I'm doing in this sort of Hegelian sense of making the thing available. So we continue. So Heidegger says we have to continually. Nothing is old in philosophy, but that, and we have to continually um, uh, anew go through everything every time we touch upon it. So that has to do um, with repeatedly bringing up um, the position we reach at the end of German idealism, where Schelling shows us the so-called abyss of freedom, and in a way the touchstone of maybe Jasper's version of existentialism, which Heidegger in a way keeps in contact with, and uh, this Nietzschean sense that we, to some extent, um, history is always elusive, and we can't predict what's going to happen. But to another extent, there's a kind of Heideggerian uh, dogma that's always at work, but sort of a good dogma in the sense that Heidegger demands not the total um, headlong casting of oneself into um, this elusiveness, or into this abyss in which, when you look into it, it looks back, and then one kind of loses a sense of what's going on. But to keep to what he says in the discussion with the Buddhist monk, where he says the West at its highest point, which meaning him himself, his own thinking, um, must keep with the Seinfrage, or with being, which was inherited since Parmenides. And so not as the Seinfrage, but Parmenides opened this question of being as availability. But with the Seinfrage, we don't only treat it as the available, but more in the mode of this so-called Ereignis, or the uh, put the Heidegger is putting it in more than one form, is a venting, as it were, as rather than um, as something that happens, as in Hegel for nous, having an available thing for itself. So the nous, which was first raised by Anaxagoras, as this question of neither neither earth, neither water, neither air, neither fire, neither some fifth element, but nous. But I suppose nous is actually identified with that fifth element, but we'll try to retouch on that. And that's like at the beginning of history, when the blind man opens his eyes and is subjected to these intense emotions of seeing this notion of space, of number, of nothingness, of being, of the other basic things which hold identity, which hold logic together, and hold the thinking of the West together. And then at the end of history, these sort of there's a fusion where the nous disappears again, as Hegel tells us in a sort of ambiguous statement at the beginning of his Logic. Like whether we can still say nous is active at the end of history when the things go dark, or whether we can't. It's kind of ambiguous because he still retains idea of being, but in a new dogmatic form as um, the coincidence of nothingness and being, which amounts to saying. Uh, and I'll try to touch on this and clarify what the thought is there, so we can move in it a little bit more freely at the end of history. So the presentation is, um, let's look at it in the form of sort of Circe's vase, as it's kind of touched by the kind of fingernails of Kristen Stewart. Let's say if Kristen Stewart is sort of the furthest outpost of modernity. So, Fukuyama says history, Hegel's history, we can understand as synonymous with development or modernity. So remember, Dugin is sort of the passionary and most forcible foe of modernity. And so this is why this is kind of like Dugin versus Kristen Stewart. And then we have this kind of at the beginning of history of the Western thought. So for a second, let's distance ourselves from that in this sort of post-new historicist manner. And we could look at that from the point of view of Dostoevsky's Bezi, or Demons, where there's this very vigorous discussion between Stravagin and Shatov around the time of the Franco-Prussian War. I think it's setting in the novel. Maybe I'm not sure if it takes place at exactly the time he wrote it. It actually does take place fairly close to that, at least. But the discussion it contains a synopsis where Dostoevsky shows his keen awareness of the fact that the Greek thinking, taken as Western history, taken as the beginning of political thought, with Plato, Socrates, and with the pre-Socratics, is a special history, and it's one alongside others. And this special notion of what knowledge is, what truth is, which he doesn't outright reject. He just said this is the Greek idea, and he also says, well, if it should turn out to be against Christ, then I'll pick Christ instead. So this idea we could directly understand this way. There's a container, which I'm analogizing to the vase of Circe, or the thing Kristen Stewart is tapping her fingernails against and breaking. And so Sully Prudhomme has produced this poem called La Vase Brisée, and the broken vase. And there he says this break is caused by the light blow of a woman's fan. This vase corresponds to the pre-Ptolemaic physics. So the pre-Ptolemaic physics thinks, it looks at the sky, it just sees the uniform motion of the planets, and it understands them as perfect circles, which we sort of still remember. Goethe still remembers in his phrase that architecture is frozen music, by which he draws on the classical interpretation, which has come down to us from antiquity, which says that when we're doing astronomy, what we're doing is we're putting mathematics in the sky. Astronomy is mathematics, or episteme in the sky. And music is supposed to be mathematics in time, so that Goethe makes this connection between mathematics and time, music, and architecture. So it's frozen mathematics in this sense. This notion of the immediate, this isn't a notion of the immediate and direct availability of eternity, because remember, Aristotle says, as against the Christian teaching, that the system of nature, these so-called crystalline spheres, which Aristotle, Plato, Eudoxus has brought forward, in which Ptolemy has broken from. Ptolemy is the longest lasting system of astronomy and of in a certain sense of physics that there ever was. Um, I mean, so maybe we could say the Egyptians had some version, but it moves in a different. Um, we're exact. We have to say it's not moving in the same sense of the claim about science as telling us something that's true, and true means eternally true. So what's the first step? Is we have direct access to something eternally true, meaning this unvarying motions of the stars and their circle, and the circle is thought as this platonic container space, so that it's this idea that's broken. Um, so first, kind of with Hume's provocation, that it's like we don't know where the end of empirical things are, things that we can observe, and where we're putting in our concepts such as causality. And then, uh, okay, so the Irishman, Berkeley, um, has extended this and observed that our notion of space is basically synonymous in this context with nothingness. So space and nothingness, so far as physics are concerned, are synonymous because we can't actually observe space. And especially in this specific sense that physics requires of uh, locomotion. So, in other words, movement from location to location. This is already, I think this is demonstrated basically in, I think this is demonstrated basically in Descartes, but Berkeley really clarifies it with that remark. It's like, yeah, space and nothingness absolutely named the same thing. I think there's a connection here. We could connect it to G.E. Moore, who's kind of the authority behind Bertrand Russell with respect to metaphysics, and this claim that existence has no clear meaning. So it's like existence, space, nothingness. They all have no clear observable meaning. So this is the break in the vase, and it's also the meaning of. So epistemology is a post-Kantian notion, and it's the dominant notion today. And what it means is it's exactly this Humean, the power of this Humean provocation, and that it can't be. So it's never been decomposed. So, but it's only 300 years old. It's never been decomposed. We can't sort of sort out where the bounds of hypotheses, like different notions of causality are, and where actual observation is. And this gives rise to the sense that, okay, so for example, a simple example of how this works, the Ptolemaic system, you could make 80 steps, the epicycles and so on, and then you could correctly predict the movement of the moon, of the stars, and so on. And Copernicus comes along and says, oh, but we could do it in 40 steps because it's too cumbersome. And so there's a lot of things like this in mathematics. So the movement from, the old Pythagorean method of getting them at the area of the circle, it's superseded in modernity, and then by Newton and Leibniz, and it's easier. So calculus is just simpler, easier to take the area of a curved surface, but it's no longer just a circle. But the question is, because it was observed, I think Kepler and some other people, that there's not perfect circles in the sky. So we can't simply say with mathematics, as Penrose still does. At least that's one proof that we can't. It's not definitive. But that is elliptical motion, which is then understood mathematically as a cut in a canonical section in a cone, and a slice in a cone gives you an ellipsis. And then so then we want to take the area of that, and then there's already methods to do that, but they considered too cumbersome. So then Newton and Leibniz came up with the calculus. like like after like 20 years of thinking about it, which they had time to do because they weren't liberals who were totally concerned with utilitarianism. I think, by the way, like liberalism is more about utilitarianism than anything else, like Bentham and so on. But that on the side. So uh, that's the big break, I think, epistemologically. But if you superimpose that over another factor, you get a more full picture. But then the problem is, like, how do we fuse these different pictures together without confusing them, right? So you have the other picture is that liberalism is the kind of liberalism is the ideology that goes along with um, the commercial society or mercantile society since like 1688 when the Dutch started their republic. So you have these early republics before the ones we usually talk about, the Dutch Republic and the so-called Free State of Geneva, from which the clockmaker's boy Rousseau has emerged. So like, and then you see like people like, the Dutch masters of like the 17th century, the painters. What are they mostly doing? It's like they're painting sort of the private lives and the daily lives, um, pictures of fruit on tables, um, pretty vases, and fish hanging from the wall or something in the houses of these Dutch um, commercial masters of the universe. And these are people that are basically in the German context. We call these like bourgeois, and these are people that don't want to go to war. Basically, uh, I guess there's like a random statement. It's like I said, Gauguin was like didn't want to go to war, but actually did fight in um, the Franco-Prussian War. But I don't think he really wanted to go. But anyway, in the context of one of my earlier discussions about the Bohemian lifestyle as against right or left, as basically defined by this movement into liberalism from the former thing. So it's sort of like military culture was the thing since antiquity. Agamemnon, uh, Achilles, Ares, Zeus, and then like commercial culture became the thing after like maybe 1688 or after the East India companies got started around 1700 and so forth. And we're still in that period, and you can still see these transitions. Um, and then there's different things we can superimpose, which can confuse us again. So we try to fuse them without confusing them, but it's like you have this so-called defensive modernity of Fukuyama. So like, I think it's like later on in like 1820s, Pasha Muhammad Ali dissolves the Platonic group called the Janissaries, because the Janissaries was made on who ruled or managed, as it were, the Ottoman Empire. Were chosen basically in the way the Dalai Lama is chosen. Like you go out into the countryside and find kids that look promising, and then you bring them into it. So you tell the parents, like, we're going to give them a good life, good education. They already know what a janissary is. It's like a guy wearing nice, silk cloth and in charge of a lot of people and so on. But these are people that at the same time, um, uh, it fulfilled, just like the Dalai Lama, the basic idea in Plato is that the families are the origin of all evil. So it's like, like Milton Friedman says, America is not individualist, it's about families. Um, because that's the source of this pneumatic energy, which acts as in a war against everyone else. They go, my family first, and generally speaking, from within that Western horizon, it's like it seems monstrous somehow that somebody would do the thing that happens in the Socratic version, that in the Euthyphro, where Euthyphro is like turning in his own father for something that a lot of people wouldn't even consider a crime. And so, like, in the same way, we have these examples in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany of people turning in their relatives for crimes against society rather than like doing what is tacitly expected of people in the West, of taking the side of their family against um, against society in a situation like that. So that's the Janissaries, just like the Dalai Lama, avoid that by having leaders that don't have a family interest in that sense. And this idea goes back to Plato, but then the so-called defense of modernization dissolves this because um, certain forms of um, society seem to be more competitive. So it's like originally the Dutch started getting rich, so then the Spanish followed suit, and then like um, English were kind of already doing that, but they intensified it and so on. And so you see the same thing in different waves today in Ukraine. So I found a good article that's like really shows this, and it's like really compacted with a lot of details about what happens. Like that money replaces sort of a John Winthrop view of like that society is a body where everybody needs to be conscious of the joys and the sorrows of everyone else, and everyone is like a limb in the body or an organ in the body or so on. And I think the guy, I put it on my Twitter feed, but the guy's name I think is um, Benjamin Katsaruba, and this article about what happened in Ukraine after 91, because what happens is education moves with the ideology of society, and so when the ideology changed to the commercial NATO bloc ideology, the education changed, and like so one big thing is teachers lost all their authority because they became just like poor people, because everything starts to be judged on this, it's kind of uh, like on the logic of prostitution. So it's like instead of um, choosing the mate you want, you have to take things according to um, uh, some calculation, some calculative consideration. So it's the same thing. It's like society as a whole starts to say, like, which positions will give me more money, and then people, one, teachers lose all their authority because they're paid less, but two, anyone of any talent tends not to want to go into that profession anymore. So that's happened, and then that compounded with all kinds of other changes, like the values that are taught to people in schools, to even like not explicitly, but just by the way people act. Over the last 20 years has led to radical change in the tenor of Ukrainian society, right? Because there's a whole generation has been like 30 years. Okay, so that much on. Let me reiterate one more time. Like, so, yeah, the direct vision of eternity in the sky as the movement of the planets um, corresponds to the notion that we have access to eternity. That's one notion of it. And it's undercut by simply physical discoveries. And it's undercut by the fact that even though early on Copernicus and Kepler were maintained their discoveries on the basis of a mathematical hypotheses. Our math is more beautiful and so forth, more elegant. But then, so like originally there was like no physical proofs, and all the physical proofs were against Copernicus, but people accepted it because they had this, like Penrose Platonic belief in the mathematics, and then, but it proved to be right. So it was like it seemed like the Pythagorean type of view had a sense to it. And then the people like, you know, Bishop Barkley came along and said, wait a second, like, he repeats several times, like an Irishman can't attain to these truths. Like, in other words, like it's nonsense. Um, but then you have, so for example, you have, so Feynman gives this example. I was trying to, sorry, let me go back to that. I was trying to give this example of how hypotheses can be totally wrong, but they still function, right? So it's like you can get the same information about, you can predict just as well based on um, the Ptolemaic system as you can based on the Copernican system, and maybe you could do it a little better with the Einstein system, right? But you could also do it with the Mayan system, as Richard Feynman points out. It's indifferent in a way. Um, if the only standard is prediction, then the math ceases to have any real meaning. It's a mechanical thing. Um, and this old view that thought, yeah, we have this direct vision of of episteme in the sky, lent itself to the view that nature is good. Like and nature is good, and we can understand it directly. And basically, this is this sort. So, like Jordan Peterson and people like that totally misunderstand this. Is that Protagoras, when he says, "Man is the measure of all things," what's meant there is that nature is good. It's produced man, man is the rational animal, which who can know all things, who is the measure of all things. And so when that's dispelled by the crack in the vase, then it's like, wait a second, then that's actually what causes relativism. So it's the reverse, like what like Peterson thinks. It's because then nature no longer appears as a standard by which we can judge things. Nature meaning this nature which has brought forward the human being, which is the good standard, which can know the eternal truths, which can observe them, and so forth. And then, so we could remember that as the distinction between episteme, ancient, up until recent, and epistemology, the radical doubt of all things corresponding to Hume. And though, let me say one more thing. I think I already said that, but it's sort of like what goes along with that is like the idea that, um, yeah, the sweetness of just being in Aristotle and so on. And then there's other, there's all kinds of other reasons to attack that with regard to the rise of commercial society, but that's the sort of uh, the reason in connection with philosophy, which became science in the West.